Causal loop. A causal loop is a theoretical concept in time travel where an event is both the cause and the effect of itself. This means that an occurrence in the past leads to an event in the future, which then loops back and causes the original event to happen. Unlike paradoxes that create contradictions, a causal loop is self-consistent, meaning that the sequence of events completes itself with no external cause. This creates a situation where information, objects, or actions exist without an identifiable point of origin, making it one of the most perplexing ideas in time travel theory. One classic example of a causal loop is the case of a person traveling back in time to inspire their younger self to become a scientist. If this inspiration leads to them inventing the time machine that allows them to travel back in time in the first place, then where did the original inspiration come from? There is no beginning or end to the cycle. It simply exists as part of a closed loop. This kind of scenario raises deep philosophical and scientific questions about causality and determinism. The causal loop is often confused with the Bootstrap Paradox, but there is a key difference. A Bootstrap Paradox specifically involves an object or information with no clear origin, such as a book being handed down through time without anyone actually writing it. A causal loop, on the other hand, involves actions and events that sustain themselves without contradiction. Both concepts challenge our understanding of cause and effect, but the causal loop focuses on self-sustaining events rather than unexplained objects. In fiction, causal loops are commonly explored in time travel stories. For example, in the movie Tenet, a protagonist receives instructions from the future and follows them, only to later realize that he himself was the one who sent those instructions. Similarly, in The Terminator, John Connor sends Kyle Reese back in time to protect his mother, only for Kyle to become John's father. This creates a loop where John Connor's existence depends on events that he himself caused. Such narratives create compelling storytelling because they challenge our perception of time and free will. The scientific implications of causal loops are fascinating but problematic. If they were possible, they would suggest a deterministic universe where free will is an illusion. Everything that happens is preordained by the loop itself. Physicists have debated whether the laws of nature permit such loops. Theories like general relativity allow for closed time-like curves, CTCs, which theoretically enable causal loops, but whether they can exist in reality is still unknown. If they do, it would mean that certain events are unavoidable because they are already part of an established timeline. One major issue with causal loops is the violation of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy states that disorder in a system must always increase over time, but in a perfect causal loop, information or matter could theoretically remain unchanged forever. This suggests a violation of fundamental physical laws, making causal loops highly controversial in scientific discussions. Some physicists propose that quantum mechanics might resolve these contradictions by introducing uncertainty and probabilistic outcomes, which could prevent stable causal loops from forming. Philosophically, causal loops raise deep existential questions. If an event is caused by itself, does that mean everything in the universe is predetermined? Would that eliminate the possibility of free will? Some interpretations suggest that causal loops might only be possible in a block universe, where time is fixed and past, present, and future all coexist. This idea aligns with the Novikov self-consistency principle, which states that any action taken in the past must be self-consistent and cannot change the future in a way that creates a contradiction. Despite being purely theoretical for now, causal loops continue to intrigue scientists, writers, and philosophers alike. They challenge our basic understanding of time and causality, while opening up endless possibilities for storytelling and scientific exploration. If technology ever allows time travel, understanding causal loops will be crucial to ensuring logical consistency. Whether they are a paradox, a scientific possibility, or merely a fascinating concept, they remain one of the most intriguing topics in the realm of time travel. Predestination Paradox. A predestination paradox occurs when a person traveling back in time inadvertently causes the very event they were trying to prevent or investigate. This type of time loop suggests that the future is fixed and unchangeable, no matter what actions are taken. Essentially, the time traveler's actions in the past are already part of history, meaning they cannot alter the outcome, only fulfill it. This paradox challenges the idea of free will, suggesting that all choices are predetermined by the timeline itself. A classic example of a predestination paradox is the Greek myth of Oedipus. Despite efforts to avoid his fate, Oedipus unknowingly fulfills the prophecy by killing his father and marrying his mother. In time travel fiction, a similar paradox might occur if someone goes back in time to prevent a disaster but accidentally causes it instead. For example, if a scientist travels to the past to stop a virus outbreak but becomes the person who releases the virus, their attempt to change history only ensures the event happens. This paradox suggests a self-consistent timeline where past, present, and future events are locked in place. According to this model, any action a time traveler takes was always meant to happen, meaning there are no alternate timelines or realities. This is consistent with the Novikov self-consistency principle, which argues that the laws of physics prevent paradoxes by ensuring that time travel actions cannot change established events. Essentially, the universe corrects itself to maintain consistency. Philosophically, the predestination paradox raises questions about free will versus determinism. If time travel is possible, but every action is preordained, do individuals truly have control over their decisions? This paradox implies that free will might be an illusion because every action is already part of a fixed loop. Some philosophers argue that even if the future appears inevitable, the illusion of choice remains meaningful, while others suggest that time travel would strip away any genuine autonomy. In popular culture, predestination paradoxes are a frequent plot device. In the film 12 Monkeys, a man is sent back in time to stop a deadly virus, but becomes part of the events that cause its release. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry saves himself from danger, only to realize he was the mysterious figure who did it. These stories highlight the eerie inevitability of time loops, where even attempts to change the past only reinforce the pre-existing timeline. From a scientific standpoint, general relativity allows for the theoretical existence of closed time-like curves, CTCs, which could produce scenarios resembling a predestination paradox. However, many physicists believe that quantum mechanics introduces uncertainty, preventing rigid causal loops. One speculative idea is that alternate timelines or parallel universes could form if someone changes the past, avoiding paradoxes altogether. Still, there is no empirical evidence to confirm whether such phenomena could occur. The emotional and psychological impact of a predestination paradox is profound. Imagine realizing that no matter how hard you try, you cannot change fate. You are merely a cog in the machinery of time. This idea can evoke both awe and dread. For time travelers, this might lead to a sense of fatalism, where their actions feel meaningless because the outcome is inevitable. On the other hand, it could also suggest a comforting order to the universe, where everything happens for a reason. Despite its complexities, the predestination paradox remains a captivating concept because it blurs the boundaries between fate and free will. It forces us to consider whether the future is truly open, or if we are simply following a script already written by time itself. Whether viewed through the lens of physics, philosophy, or fiction, the paradox continues to spark debate and imagination, pushing us to reconsider the nature of time and our place within it. Bootstrap Paradox. The Bootstrap Paradox, also known as an ontological paradox, occurs when an object, piece of information, or event exists without a clear point of origin. It forms a closed causal loop where something appears to be self-created, existing indefinitely without ever being made in the first place. This paradox challenges our understanding of causality by presenting a scenario where the cause and effect seem to create each other in an infinite loop. One of the most famous examples of the Bootstrap Paradox involves a time traveler and a book. Suppose a man finds an old book about quantum mechanics in the present and decides to travel back in time to give it to a young physicist. That physicist then publishes the book under their own name, and over time, it becomes famous. Centuries later, the same book is discovered by the time traveler, who then takes it back in time again. The paradox is, who originally wrote the book? It has no true origin. It simply exists in an endless loop. A well-known fictional example of this paradox appears in Doctor Who. The Doctor plays Beethoven's symphonies in the past after discovering that Beethoven never wrote them. Later, these symphonies become the originals that history remembers. If Beethoven never composed them, yet they exist, where did they come from? This paradox suggests that certain things might exist without a clear point of creation, seemingly appearing out of nowhere. This paradox differs from the causal loop, though they are related. A causal loop involves events sustaining themselves, whereas a bootstrap paradox specifically deals with objects or information that seem to have no origin. This presents a major philosophical and scientific problem. If something exists without an initial cause, does that mean reality can generate things out of nothing? The paradox defies the logical principle of causality, which states that every effect must have a cause. From a scientific perspective, bootstrap paradoxes raise significant questions about the laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. However, a bootstrap paradox suggests that an object or information can exist without being created, which seemingly violates this principle. Some scientists theorize that quantum mechanics could provide a loophole where particles or information might emerge through quantum fluctuations, though this remains speculative. The paradox also ties into the concept of self-fulfilling prophecies. Imagine someone traveling back in time and telling Shakespeare about his famous plays, only for Shakespeare to write them based on this knowledge. If Shakespeare only wrote them because of future knowledge, and the future knowledge came from his own works, then who originally created them? This suggests that time travel might not allow for creativity or true innovation, only repetition of existing ideas. Philosophically, the bootstrap paradox forces us to reconsider how knowledge, creativity, and existence itself function. If an idea or object exists without an origin, does it still have meaning? Can something be real if it has no beginning? Some interpretations suggest that bootstrap paradoxes imply a deterministic universe where time is a self-contained structure rather than a linear progression. Others argue that they point toward multiple timelines or alternative explanations beyond our current understanding of time. Despite being a theoretical concept, the bootstrap paradox continues to inspire debate in science fiction, physics, and philosophy. It challenges our perception of reality, causality, and existence itself. Whether or not time travel is ever proven possible, the bootstrap paradox remains a fascinating thought experiment, demonstrating just how complex and mysterious the nature of time truly is. Fixed time loop. A fixed time loop is a scenario in which events unfold in a predetermined and unchangeable sequence, meaning that any attempt to alter the past or future will always lead to the same outcome. Unlike paradoxes where contradictions arise, a fixed time loop follows the principle that time is self-consistent. What has happened will always happen, no matter what. This concept aligns with the Novikov self-consistency principle, which suggests that time travel cannot create contradictions because any action taken was already part of history. One of the clearest examples of a fixed time loop is a person trying to change an event, but only ensuring it happens. Suppose someone goes back in time to prevent a fire, but accidentally knocks over a lantern, causing the very fire they intended to stop. Their actions were not random. They were always part of history. No matter how many times they attempt to change the event, it will always play out the same way because their involvement was already written into the timeline. This idea appears frequently in fiction. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry believes he is saved by a mysterious figure, only to later realize that he himself traveled back in time to perform the rescue. He was always the person who saved himself. His actions were predestined. Similarly, in The Time Machine 2002, the protagonist tries to prevent his fiancée's death, but every attempt results in a different cause of death, reinforcing the idea that the event cannot be changed. A fixed time loop suggests that time is non-linear but self-contained, meaning that even if time travel is possible, the past, present, and future are locked in place. This concept contrasts with alternate timeline theories, where changing the past creates a new reality. Instead, in a fixed time loop, history is one singular, unbreakable timeline where all events are bound to happen exactly as they always did. Scientifically, general relativity allows for closed time-like curves, CTCs, which theoretically enable time loops. However, quantum mechanics introduces uncertainty, which might prevent strict determinism. Some physicists argue that minor changes could occur, but would always correct themselves to maintain consistency. This could mean that even if free will exists, it is constrained within the boundaries of a fixed timeline. Philosophically, a fixed time loop raises profound questions about free will versus determinism. If all events are predestined, does choice truly exist? Are time travelers simply actors in a play where the script cannot be rewritten? This idea aligns with the ancient Stoic philosophy, which suggests that fate governs all things and resistance is futile. However, others argue that even if actions are predetermined, the experience of making choices still holds meaning. The psychological impact of a fixed time loop can be unsettling. If a person realizes that their actions are inevitable, they might experience existential dread or fatalism, believing that nothing they do matters. On the other hand, some might find comfort in the idea that events are part of a larger design, removing uncertainty from life. Whether viewed as a curse or a reassurance, the concept of a fixed time loop challenges our fundamental understanding of control and destiny. Despite being a theoretical concept, fixed time loops remain one of the most fascinating ideas in time travel theory. They provide endless storytelling possibilities while also raising deep philosophical and scientific questions. If time travel is ever proven possible, understanding whether we live in a fixed timeline or one that can be altered will be crucial. Until then, the debate over free will, fate, and the nature of time continues. Infinite Regress Paradox. The infinite regress paradox occurs when an event, explanation, or cause relies on an endless sequence of preceding events, making it impossible to pinpoint an ultimate origin. This paradox appears in time travel, philosophy, and logic, creating a frustrating loop where each answer only raises another unanswered question. In time loops, it manifests when a person, object, or event depends on something that itself requires an explanation, leading to an infinite cycle without a clear beginning. A classic example in time travel is a time traveler who teaches a historical figure their own discoveries. Imagine a scientist from the future travels back in time and teaches Einstein the theory of relativity, which he then publishes. If Einstein only learned it from the future traveler, and the future traveler only knew it because Einstein published it, then who originally discovered the theory? The knowledge has no starting point, creating an infinite regress where information seems to exist without origin. Another variation is the infinite loop of time travelers. Suppose a person receives a mysterious book about time travel, studies it, and later goes back in time to give the book to their younger self. That younger self then grows up, studies the book, and repeats the cycle. Since the book has no original author, it exists in a paradoxical loop. This leads to a deeper problem. If time loops can infinitely sustain themselves, do they ever need a logical origin at all? The turtle problem is a famous philosophical analogy of infinite regress. A student asks what holds up the earth, and the teacher responds, "It rests on the back of a giant turtle." When the student asks what supports the turtle, the answer is another turtle. This pattern repeats infinitely, leading to the phrase, "It's turtles all the way down." This illustrates how an infinite regress is often used as a lazy explanation, one that avoids answering the real question. In physics, the infinite regress paradox challenges the idea of causality and the nature of time. If every cause must have a prior cause, then what was the first cause? The Big Bang theory suggests that time and space began at a single point, but what caused that event? If the answer requires another event before it, then an infinite regress arises. Some theories attempt to solve this problem by proposing cyclical universes where time endlessly repeats in a cosmic loop. Philosophically, the infinite regress paradox is central to debates about first causes and the nature of knowledge. Aristotle argued that all reasoning must start from self-evident truths to avoid infinite regress. This influenced arguments about the existence of God. If every effect requires a cause, then does that mean there must be an uncaused first cause? Many religious and philosophical traditions have tried to address this problem, but it remains an open debate. The paradox also appears in decision-making and logic. Suppose a robot is programmed to always check for the best decision before acting. If it must check an infinite number of options before making a choice, it will never actually act. This illustrates the problem of infinite recursion in computing, where a system calls itself endlessly without resolution, leading to a crash. This is why computers must have base cases to prevent infinite loops. Ultimately, the infinite regress paradox highlights the limits of human understanding. Whether in time travel, cosmology, or philosophy, it forces us to ask whether the universe needs a first cause, or if some things simply exist without explanation. If time travel ever becomes possible, we may need to reconsider how causality works, or whether some events are simply part of an eternal, unbreakable cycle. Grandfather paradox in loops. The grandfather paradox is one of the most famous time travel paradoxes, questioning whether changing the past can alter the future in a contradictory way. The classic thought experiment asks, what if you traveled back in time and prevented your grandfather from meeting your grandmother? This would mean you were never born, which in turn means you never traveled back to prevent their meeting. But if you never traveled back, your grandparents would meet, you would be born, and you would eventually travel back, creating an impossible logical loop. In a time loop variation of the grandfather paradox, the contradiction is repeated endlessly. Suppose a person tries to prevent an event, but every attempt they make accidentally ensures that the event happens. For example, a time traveler might go back to stop a war, but accidentally gives information to the wrong person, triggering the war instead. No matter how many times they loop back to fix it, they always end up being the cause of the event they wanted to prevent. This creates a self-perpetuating paradoxical loop. This paradox presents a serious problem for time travel theories, because it suggests that certain actions in the past could create causal contradictions. If changing the past eliminates the cause of time travel itself, then how could the change happen in the first place? Some scientists argue that physics must prevent such paradoxes from occurring, leading to theories like the Novikov self-consistency principle, which states that time travel is only possible in ways that do not alter the past inconsistently. A potential resolution to this paradox is the multiple timelines theory. In this model, when someone changes the past, they do not alter their own timeline, but instead create a branching reality. This means that the time traveler's original past remains unchanged, but they have shifted to a new universe where the change occurred. This is a common solution in science fiction, used in movies like Avengers: Endgame, where altering past events results in different timelines rather than contradictions. Another possible explanation is that the universe corrects itself. Suppose you travel back to prevent your grandfather's death, but every attempt you make results in unforeseen consequences that still lead to his survival. This would imply that history is self-repairing, making true changes to the past impossible. This idea aligns with the fixed timeline theory, where history cannot be rewritten, only fulfilled in different ways. The grandfather paradox also raises profound philosophical questions about free will and determinism. If time travelers can change the past, does that mean history is malleable, or are they just fulfilling their roles in a predetermined cycle? If the paradox prevents them from making changes, does that mean free will is an illusion? Some interpretations suggest that time travel is inherently restricted, meaning travelers can interact with the past but cannot alter fundamental historical events. The paradox is frequently explored in science fiction. In Back to the Future, Marty McFly nearly prevents his parents from meeting, risking his own existence. In The Flash, time travel leads to unintended consequences, causing ripple effects that often make things worse. These stories highlight the dangers of tampering with time and the unintended consequences that can arise. Ultimately, the grandfather paradox in loops forces us to rethink our understanding of time, causality, and reality. If time travel ever becomes possible, understanding how to avoid paradoxes will be crucial. Whether through self-consistency, branching timelines, or quantum mechanics, solving this paradox could unlock the mysteries of time itself, or prove that some actions are simply impossible, no matter how many loops we try. Quantum time loops. Quantum time loops explore the idea that time loops can exist at the quantum level, governed by the strange and unpredictable laws of quantum mechanics. Unlike classical time loops, which often rely on fixed or paradoxical causality, quantum time loops involve uncertainty, superposition, and probabilistic outcomes. This suggests that an event caught in a time loop might not always repeat in the exact same way, but instead exist in a shifting, uncertain state, influenced by observation and probability. One of the key ideas supporting quantum time loops is the many worlds interpretation, MWI, of quantum mechanics. According to MWI, every quantum event creates a branching set of possible realities. If time loops exist in this framework, a traveler might enter a loop where each iteration leads to a slightly different version of events. This would mean that rather than a rigid, repeating cycle, quantum time loops could allow for variation, where the outcome is determined probabilistically rather than deterministically. Another important concept is quantum superposition, famously illustrated by Schrödinger's cat. In this thought experiment, a cat in a box is both alive and dead until observed. If a time loop functions similarly, then an event within the loop might exist in multiple possible states until it is observed or measured. This means that the moment a time traveler interferes, the loop could collapse into a single reality, potentially explaining why time loops might end or change unpredictably when interacted with. The delayed choice quantum eraser experiment also hints at the possibility of retrocausality, where the future can influence the past. If information from the future can affect past events at the quantum level, then time loops might be self-adjusting, allowing changes to ripple backward in time. This could mean that in a quantum time loop, every loop iteration subtly alters past events, but in a way that preserves overall consistency. Quantum time loops could also resolve some paradoxes found in classical time travel theories. If a person enters a time loop but their quantum state remains in flux, then they might not experience the same loop identically each time. This could prevent strict causal paradoxes, like the grandfather paradox, since small variations might allow history to remain self-consistent while still permitting time loops. The role of observers in quantum mechanics also plays a crucial part in quantum time loops. If observation collapses a wave function into a single state, then perhaps time loops are only solidified when they are perceived. This could mean that an unobserved time loop remains in multiple possible configurations until someone within the loop becomes aware of it, causing it to take a specific form. This aligns with observer-dependent time travel theories, where the act of noticing the loop might be what defines it. In fiction, quantum time loops often appear in stories where reality itself is unstable. In Interstellar, the protagonist's ability to send information back through time relies on quantum data. In Tenet, characters manipulate time using quantum inversion, where objects and people move backward while interacting with forward-moving time. These narratives explore the idea that time loops are not rigid, but instead flexible and influenced by probability, observation, and choice. If quantum time loops are real, they could revolutionize our understanding of cause and effect, consciousness, and the fundamental structure of time. They suggest that rather than time being a fixed, linear sequence, it might behave like a probabilistic web of possibilities, where loops are an inevitable consequence of quantum mechanics. Whether or not we ever harness these loops for time travel, quantum time loops challenge our deepest assumptions about reality and the way time truly works. Butterfly effect in loops. The butterfly effect is a concept from chaos theory that suggests small changes in initial conditions can lead to vastly different outcomes over time. When applied to time loops, it raises an intriguing question. If an event keeps repeating in a loop, can tiny variations in each cycle lead to completely different results? Unlike fixed time loops, where events always unfold the same way, butterfly effect loops suggest that even the slightest deviation, like stepping on a leaf or hesitating for a moment, could drastically alter the future. A classic example of the butterfly effect comes from Ray Bradbury's short story, A Sound of Thunder, where a time traveler steps on a butterfly in the past, unknowingly altering the course of history. In a time loop, this could mean that even if someone relives the same moment repeatedly, the accumulation of small differences could create a cascade of unpredictable consequences, making each loop increasingly unrecognizable from the last. This effect poses a significant challenge for anyone trapped in a time loop. If small actions can create massive consequences, then controlling the loop becomes nearly impossible. Suppose a scientist in a loop is trying to prevent a disaster. Each time they adjust a variable, unintended changes ripple outward, making the situation worse rather than better. This could explain why, in some time loop stories, characters struggle to break free, because every attempt at change produces new, unforeseen problems. In quantum mechanics, the butterfly effect could be amplified by observer effects. The mere act of knowing one is in a loop might alter how a person behaves, leading to different choices and ultimately changing the outcome. If a time loop exists at the quantum level, then minor fluctuations, like a single atom behaving differently, could snowball into massive changes, making some loops fundamentally unstable. A fascinating implication of the butterfly effect in loops is the idea that escaping the loop might require absolute precision. If a person has to repeat an event perfectly in order to break free, but every tiny change disrupts the process, then they might be trapped indefinitely. This could explain why some time loop scenarios appear inescapable, because the exact conditions for breaking the cycle are impossibly precise. In fiction, movies like Edge of Tomorrow and Groundhog Day explore this idea. In Edge of Tomorrow, each reset of the loop allows the protagonist to improve his performance, but small changes sometimes lead to drastically different outcomes. In Groundhog Day, the protagonist's behavior gradually shapes the world around him, showing how even a tiny shift in attitude can change everything. These stories highlight how time loops are not just about repetition, but about cumulative change and adaptation. Philosophically, the butterfly effect in loops raises questions about free will and fate. If every choice affects the future, is it possible to find an optimal path through a time loop, or will unintended consequences always arise? This suggests that even if time loops exist, their outcomes may never be fully predictable, reinforcing the idea that true control over time is an illusion. Ultimately, the butterfly effect in loops challenges the idea that time loops are predictable or stable. Instead, it suggests that each iteration, no matter how small, can introduce chaos, making the loop a dynamic, ever-evolving phenomenon. Whether in science fiction or real physics, the idea that time loops can spiral out of control due to minuscule changes makes them one of the most complex and fascinating concepts in time travel theory. Entropy reset paradox. The entropy reset paradox is a theoretical issue that arises when time loops seem to violate the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. Entropy, which measures disorder in a system, always increases over time according to the second law of thermodynamics. However, if a time loop resets events to an earlier state, it implies that entropy is decreasing, contradicting what we know about the natural progression of time. This paradox raises a profound question. How can a time loop reset reality while maintaining logical consistency with the laws of physics? One way to understand this paradox is to imagine a closed time loop in which a person or object continuously relives the same moment. If entropy increases during each cycle, then logically, after infinite loops, the system should reach maximum disorder. Yet the loop keeps resetting. This suggests either that entropy is somehow reversed each time, which contradicts thermodynamics, or that time loops function outside our known physical laws. A potential resolution comes from the concept of information erasure. If the universe somehow forgets previous loops upon reset, then entropy may not accumulate. This aligns with some interpretations of quantum mechanics, where wave functions collapse upon observation. If time loops involve resetting not just physical matter, but also quantum states, then entropy might be reset along with them. However, this would require a mechanism beyond our current understanding of physics. Some physicists propose that time loops could exist in a thermodynamic bubble, where entropy behaves differently than in the rest of the universe. This would mean that while the external universe continues its normal increase in entropy, the localized looped region remains unaffected. If true, this could explain why some theories suggest that time travel, if possible, might require exotic conditions like negative energy or closed time-like curves. Another explanation involves the idea of parallel timelines. If a time loop creates a new branch of reality rather than truly resetting, then entropy does not decrease. It it simply follows a different path. This would mean that each loop is not a perfect reset, but instead a shift to an identical timeline with slightly different quantum properties. In this view, the paradox disappears because no true reversal of entropy is happening, only an illusion of repetition. Philosophically, the entropy reset paradox challenges the idea of irreversibility in nature. If time loops can truly reset without consequences, then what does this say about the fundamental direction of time? Many scientists believe that the arrow of time is tied to entropy, meaning time only flows forward because disorder increases. If a loop can violate this rule, does that mean time itself is not as rigid as we believe? In fiction, the entropy reset paradox is often ignored, but some stories touch on its implications. In Tenet, time inversion allows objects to move backward in time, creating situations where entropy appears reversed, leading to strange effects like backward burning fires. In Edge of Tomorrow, each reset seems to restore the protagonist's body and environment to a prior state, but how this affects entropy is left unexplained. These examples show that time loops often rely on unknown physics that challenge our understanding of reality. Ultimately, the entropy reset paradox forces us to reconsider whether time loops could exist in a universe governed by thermodynamic laws. If entropy must always increase, then true resets should be impossible. But if time loops obey different rules, they could reveal entirely new aspects of physics, potentially unlocking a deeper understanding of time, energy, and the structure of the universe itself. Observer paradox and loops. The observer paradox in loops explores the idea that the act of observation itself could alter a time loop's behavior. In quantum mechanics, the observer effect states that measuring a system changes its state. If time loops exist, does the awareness of a loop influence its outcome? Can an observer's knowledge of being in a loop change the loop itself? This paradox raises profound questions about consciousness, free will, and the fundamental nature of time. One possibility is that an observer inside a time loop collapses the wave function of reality, meaning that their awareness determines the loop's final outcome. If no one is aware of the loop, it might continue indefinitely, but the moment someone realizes they are in a loop, their observation could disrupt the cycle. This would align with theories in quantum mechanics, such as the many worlds interpretation, where reality branches based on observation. If an observer influences a time loop, then loops might not be fixed or deterministic. Instead, each iteration could slightly shift based on the observer's growing knowledge. Suppose a person relives the same day but gains memories from previous loops. This knowledge alone might introduce variations in their behavior, subtly altering the timeline until the loop is broken. This raises the question, are time loops truly repeating, or are they dynamically changing based on observation? This paradox also touches on self-awareness and memory retention. If an observer inside a loop retains memories while the rest of the world resets, does that mean their consciousness exists outside of time? If so, this suggests that minds operate under different laws than physical systems, hinting at the possibility that consciousness itself may be independent of time loops. A more extreme version of this paradox suggests that loops may only exist if they remain unnoticed. If the act of realizing one is in a loop causes it to break or change, then truly perfect loops might be impossible. This would mean that as soon as someone suspects they are in a loop, they have already altered it, leading to a gradual unraveling of the cycle rather than a perfect repetition. The philosophical implications of this paradox are immense. If an observer inside a loop can change it through awareness, does that mean free will exists only when one recognizes the illusion of repetition? It could mean that loops function like tests, where the goal is to reach a level of awareness that allows escape. This is a common theme in mythology and storytelling, where enlightenment or self-discovery is often the key to breaking cycles. In science fiction, the observer paradox in loops is frequently explored. In The Matrix, Neo breaks free from a simulated reality after becoming aware of its nature. In Groundhog Day, the protagonist escapes his loop only after deep personal growth. In Edge of Tomorrow, awareness of the loop grants an advantage, but as soon as memory retention is lost, the cycle resumes. These narratives suggest that loops are not just physical phenomena, but also psychological and existential puzzles. Ultimately, The observer paradox in loops suggests that time loops may not be purely mechanical processes, but could be tied to perception and awareness. If observation alters a loop, then escaping or manipulating it might depend on understanding the relationship between consciousness and time. Whether this is a fundamental principle of reality or just an illusion remains one of the most fascinating questions in time loop theory. Memory retention loops. Memory retention loops explore the idea that a person trapped in a time loop might retain their memories across iterations, even as the rest of reality resets. This raises fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, time, and identity. If time truly resets, why does memory remain intact? Does it suggest that consciousness exists outside of time, or does memory itself follow different rules from physical reality? A common theme in time loop stories is that a character gradually remembers past loops, allowing them to learn and adapt. This creates a situation where the character accumulates knowledge while the rest of the world remains unaware of the loop. Such loops can be a blessing or a curse. They provide unlimited opportunities to improve, but they can also trap someone in an inescapable cycle where nothing they do seems to matter. One possible explanation for memory retention in loops is that consciousness operates outside the normal flow of time. If a person's mind exists on a different plane than physical reality, their memories might not be affected by the loop's reset. This aligns with some interpretations of quantum mechanics, where information is never truly lost, suggesting that memory could be preserved even when the universe resets around it. Another theory suggests that memory retention in loops could be a result of quantum entanglement. If the brain's neural connections rely on quantum processes, then certain memories might remain linked across resets, preventing them from being erased. This could explain why some characters in fiction gradually regain memories rather than remembering everything at once, as if their brain is slowly reconstructing links to past loops. However, memory retention loops also create significant challenges. If someone remembers everything, but the world resets, they must constantly rebuild relationships, relearn skills, and convince others of the loop's existence. This often leads to psychological strain, as the person experiences potentially infinite lifetimes without aging, causing emotional detachment or existential despair. Over time, such an individual might lose touch with reality, questioning whether they will ever escape. In fiction, memory retention loops are explored in stories like Groundhog Day, Edge of Tomorrow, and Russian Doll. In these narratives, the protagonist gradually improves their skills, learns from mistakes, and tries to break free from the cycle. The retention of memory creates a progression of knowledge, even when time itself does not move forward, allowing characters to develop despite the repetition. Philosophically, memory retention loops challenge our understanding of personal identity. If a person has lived through thousands of loops but no one else remembers, does that make them fundamentally different from the person they were before the loops began? At what point does an individual become something more than human, a being shaped by countless experiences no one else shares? This leads to deeper questions about the nature of the self and whether memory is the true foundation of identity. Ultimately, memory retention loops suggest that time loops are not just physical anomalies, but also psychological and existential challenges. If memory can persist across resets, then time loops become more than just endless cycles. They become opportunities for learning, growth, and self-discovery, but also potential prisons of isolation and despair. Whether this concept is purely fictional or hints at deeper truths about time and consciousness remains one of the most intriguing mysteries of time loop theory. Moral dilemma loop. A moral dilemma loop occurs when a person is trapped in a time loop where their actions have ethical consequences, and they must make difficult choices knowing that time will reset. This creates a paradox where moral responsibility is both absolute and meaningless. Absolute because every action can be repeated indefinitely, and meaningless because nothing seems to have permanent consequences. However, the psychological and philosophical weight of these decisions often remains, leading to profound ethical challenges. One major ethical issue in a moral dilemma loop is the problem of consequences. If someone commits an immoral act, like stealing or harming someone, but the loop resets, did the act truly happen? On one hand, no permanent harm was done. On the other, the person who remembers the act still carries the moral burden of their actions. This raises the question, does morality depend on consequences, or does it exist independently of them? A related issue is the value of life and suffering in a loop. If a person sees the same tragedy happen repeatedly, such as a disaster they cannot prevent, do they have a moral duty to keep trying to stop it, even if they know the loop will reset? This dilemma can become overwhelming, as they may experience the grief and trauma of failure countless times. Over time, they may begin to question whether morality has any meaning when the world erases every attempt to make a difference. The utilitarian versus deontological debate also plays a crucial role in a moral dilemma loop. If someone has infinite chances to experiment with different outcomes, do they have a duty to find the best possible path, even if it means making sacrifices along the way? A utilitarian might argue that the person should optimize their actions to create the best possible future if the loop ever breaks. A deontologist, on the other hand, might insist that morality exists in each moment, regardless of whether the loop resets. Psychologically, a moral dilemma loop can lead to moral desensitization or emotional detachment. If a person has no fear of permanent consequences, they might begin testing extreme actions such as manipulating people, experimenting with crimes, or even abandoning morality altogether. Over countless loops, they might start seeing people as temporary illusions rather than real individuals, leading to a complete breakdown of ethical reasoning. However, if they retain a strong moral compass, the weight of their decisions may compound, making each loop increasingly difficult to endure. In fiction, moral dilemma loops are often used to explore the development of character and ethics. Escape velocity theory. The escape velocity theory in time loops explores the idea that breaking free from a loop requires reaching a certain threshold of knowledge, personal growth, or external conditions. Just as a spacecraft must reach a specific speed to escape a planet's gravity, a person trapped in a loop may need to achieve an equivalent escape velocity in terms of actions, understanding, or choices. This theory suggests that time loops are not arbitrary, but rather tests or challenges that require a specific condition to be met before they can end. One possible explanation for this phenomenon is that loops act as learning mechanisms. In many fictional and theoretical scenarios, the person inside a time loop is stuck until they learn a crucial lesson or accomplish a specific task. This suggests that time loops may be designed, either by a higher intelligence, a universal law, or even the subconscious mind, to serve as a kind of evolutionary tool. If true, then loops function as self-contained reality simulations that force individuals to refine their actions and decisions until they reach an optimal outcome. Another interpretation is that escape from a time loop requires an energy threshold, not in the physical sense, but in terms of probability, choice, or cosmic alignment. If the loop is a closed system, then breaking free might require introducing external influence or randomness. In quantum mechanics, a system in a stable state can be disrupted by enough fluctuations, causing it to transition to a different state. Similarly, if time loops are stable configurations of reality, then escape may require an unpredictable factor, whether it be a new decision, external interference, or even a quantum fluctuation. The psychological aspect of escape velocity theory is also intriguing. Many fictional loops only break once the protagonist undergoes deep personal transformation, whether it's learning selflessness, confronting fears, or overcoming trauma. This implies that loops are not just physical anomalies, but also psychological constructs. If a person is reliving the same events due to their own unresolved issues, then true escape might only happen when they experience genuine change. This would mean that loops act as metaphors for human growth, forcing people to evolve before they can move forward in time. A major challenge in achieving escape velocity from a loop is determining what condition must be met. If loops require the correct series of actions, then escaping becomes a problem of trial and error. If the requirement is emotional or cognitive, then a person may need to undergo a fundamental shift in perspective. In either case, the challenge is that the escape condition is often unknown, making it a frustrating and sometimes existential struggle. Some people in loops may spend lifetimes attempting different strategies before realizing what they need to do. In fiction, escape velocity theory appears in stories like Groundhog Day, where the protagonist can only escape after achieving self-improvement and love. In Edge of Tomorrow, the loop is broken when external conditions, defeating an alien intelligence, are met. In The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask, the loop persists until the hero restores balance to the world. These examples reinforce the idea that loops are not random but conditional, and escaping them is often a matter of reaching a particular goal. A deeper implication of this theory is that it could apply to real-life patterns as well. Many people feel stuck in repetitive cycles, whether in relationships, careers, or personal struggles, without realizing that the key to breaking free might be internal change. If escape velocity theory is metaphorically true, then life itself might function like a time loop in some ways, requiring people to reach a certain threshold of understanding or action before they can move forward to the next stage. Ultimately, the escape velocity theory suggests that time loops are not just traps but puzzles with solutions. Whether the key is learning, randomness, external interference, or deep personal transformation, the idea that every loop has an escape condition makes them more than just endless cycles. They become tests of growth, resilience, and the ability to break free from patterns that hold us back. Loop instability. Loop instability refers to the idea that time loops are not always perfectly stable and may begin to degrade, shift, or collapse over time. While some loops appear to repeat identically, others become unstable due to changes in variables, external interference, or the increasing awareness of the individual inside them. This instability can manifest as glitches, distortions, inconsistencies, or even complete breakdowns of the loop itself. One possible cause of loop instability is observer interference. If someone inside a loop starts remembering past iterations or making unpredictable choices, their awareness might disrupt the loop's structure. Much like quantum mechanics suggests that observation can alter reality, a person's consciousness may introduce an element of unpredictability that prevents the loop from perfectly resetting. This could result in small changes accumulating over time, eventually breaking the cycle entirely. Another potential cause is entropy accumulation. While a loop may seem to reset, small details might carry over, leading to progressive distortions. For example, objects might slightly shift positions, people might act subtly differently, or new elements might appear that were not present in previous iterations. This suggests that loops, like physical systems, are not truly closed, and that small imperfections eventually lead to instability. If enough of these imperfections build up, the loop could collapse entirely. Loops might also become unstable due to external forces. If the loop is not self-contained, but exists within a larger timeline, outside influences, such as cosmic events, interventions from other entities, or even temporal fluctuations, might interfere with its structure. This could cause the loop to warp, shorten, lengthen, or fragment into multiple conflicting versions. In extreme cases, an unstable loop could merge with another timeline, creating paradoxes or even alternate realities. Psychologically, loop instability can be terrifying for the person trapped inside. If a loop begins to degrade, the individual may notice increasing inconsistencies and anomalies, leading to paranoia and uncertainty. They might struggle to determine whether they are truly looping or whether they are simply imagining changes. In some cases, the loop might become an unpredictable nightmare, sometimes repeating normally, sometimes shifting unpredictably, and sometimes skipping events altogether. In fiction, loop instability is a common theme in stories that explore time travel. In The Butterfly Effect, repeated attempts to change the past cause increasingly unstable timelines. In Doctor Who, paradoxes and interference often create loops that collapse or evolve into something unrecognizable. In Dark, time loops begin to break down due to external manipulation, leading to a complete unraveling of reality. These stories suggest that time loops are not permanent structures, but fragile, shifting constructs that can degrade over time. A major implication of loop instability is that it could offer a way to escape a time loop. If a loop is not perfectly stable, then it might eventually collapse on its own. This means that individuals trapped in a loop might not need to solve a puzzle to escape. Instead, they could simply wait for the loop to break apart naturally. However, this also introduces a danger. What happens if the collapse leads to an even worse outcome? If the loop shatters into chaotic fragments, the person inside might end up in a state far worse than the original loop. Ultimately, loop instability challenges the idea that time loops are eternally self-sustaining. Whether caused by external forces, entropy, or conscious awareness, instability suggests that loops are not perfect cycles but temporary anomalies that will eventually unravel. This raises profound questions about whether loops are natural phenomena, artificial constructs, or symptoms of a deeper instability in time itself. If loops can break, does that mean time itself is more fragile than we think? Parallel time loop theory. The parallel time loop theory suggests that multiple time loops can exist simultaneously, either as separate realities or as overlapping cycles within the same timeline. Instead of a single repeating loop, this theory proposes that each loop is part of a broader network of parallel timelines, where different versions of events unfold independently or interact with each other. This idea raises complex questions about the nature of time, reality, and free will. One interpretation of this theory is that every reset of a time loop does not erase the previous iteration, but instead creates a new branching timeline. This would mean that instead of reliving the same events, a person inside the loop is actually shifting between near-identical realities. If true, then loops are not strict repetitions but divergent paths, where each iteration contributes to a growing multiverse of slightly different outcomes. Another possibility is that multiple individuals or entities could be trapped in their own separate loops, running parallel to each other. In some cases, these loops might intersect, causing brief moments of awareness between loopers. This could explain strange phenomena such as déjà vu, unexplained memories, or encounters with people who seem to remember events that should have been erased. If loops occasionally sync up, they might allow communication between different versions of reality. If parallel loops exist, they could also interact in more dramatic ways. For instance, one version of a person might break free from their loop, while another remains trapped. This could lead to paradoxical scenarios where a character meets an alternate version of themselves, one who has already escaped, or one who has experienced countless more loops. In extreme cases, overlapping loops could collide, merging into a chaotic state where time behaves unpredictably, creating a paradoxical reality. From a scientific perspective, parallel time loop theory aligns with ideas in quantum mechanics, particularly the many worlds interpretation. In quantum physics, every decision or event has the potential to create a new branching universe. If time loops function similarly, then each reset might not erase the past, but instead shift the individual into a slightly different version of reality. This would mean that breaking free from a loop is not about escaping time itself, but rather about finding the right path through a network of loops. The psychological effects of living in a parallel time loop could be profound. If someone realizes they are not just trapped in a single loop, but cycling through countless variations, they may struggle with the concept of identity. Are they the same person in each loop? Or do different versions of themselves exist independently? If multiple loops run at once, then true escape might not be a matter of breaking the loop, but instead choosing which version of reality to settle in. In fiction, parallel time loop theory appears in stories where characters experience multiple versions of a looped reality. In The Endless, two brothers discover they are trapped in a region where different time loops coexist. In Dark, different timelines interact, leading to a complex web of loops that influence one another. In Doctor Strange, the hero repeatedly loops through battle scenarios but subtly alters each iteration, suggesting parallel loops rather than exact repetitions. These stories explore the idea that loops are not closed systems, but rather branches in a greater network of time and space. A key implication of this theory is that some loops might be inescapable, not because they are unbreakable, but because they are part of a larger system of interwoven timelines. If every escape leads to another looped reality, then true freedom might be impossible. This leads to the unsettling possibility that reality itself is a vast system of interconnected time loops, and what we perceive as linear time is merely a movement between them. Ultimately, parallel time loop theory challenges the notion that time loops are isolated events. If multiple loops can exist at once, then escaping one might simply mean entering another. This raises the profound question: is reality itself just an endless series of loops, branching infinitely into parallel versions of itself? If so, then breaking free from time might not be about escaping a single loop, but about understanding the entire structure of time itself.